Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to SALTO Digital Dialogues. It is the last session of the spring season, and it is already session 14. Time flies when you are having fun. Today we have again an exciting guest speaker in the mix, but before we let him take the stage, as you know, I'll go through a little bit of the basics why we are here. So my name is Juha Toibol-Kiviniemi, and I come from SALTO Digital Resource Center, which coordinates and runs these webinars. So some common guidelines so we don't get lost in the mix. First of all, technology-wise, as you know, Teams and all these other programs can sometimes be a bit finicky, but by making sure that you are updated to the latest possible version in which ever device you use, if the app is updated, it gives you the best chance for a smooth experience in these webinars as well. All of these sessions are recorded and they will be available afterwards on YouTube publicly, so you can share also with your friends and colleagues who couldn't be here today. You will not be able to turn your camera or microphone on by default in these sessions, but the Q&A section is open in these webinars, and we do hope that you ask a lot of insightful questions from our speakers now and in other sessions as well. The presentations will be saved afterwards for national agency staff in the NA Connect Teams environment. Now, as you know, or might not know, the content of these dialogues is mainly aimed at national agency staff and especially the digital contact points within those national agencies. But of course, now these are also open to any interested stakeholders and the general public in wherever you happen to work. And if you are here from outside the national agency circuit or watching afterwards on YouTube, you are very much welcome here as well. And as we operate in SALTO Digital in the context of Erasmus Plus and the European Solidarity Corps, we kind of stay within the digital transformation priority within these programs. Now, of course, all our speakers do not come like today from within the program as such, but that also gives you the opportunity to take something from the outside and transfer that into the context of the programs. Now, finally, as I said, if you find the content relevant, please do share it. If you have an idea for an excellent topic or speaker that we have not covered yet, please give us an email at the email that is displayed on your screen right now. And on my final point, our sessions are not so much about technology itself, but we are rather interested in the implications of that technology and the impact it can have both within the programs and also beyond the programs. And that ties in really well to our guest speaker today. So with that, I will welcome Conn Holohan to the stage. Let me get you on the screen. There we go. And today we are talking about something that connects, I think, really well with the programs, which is immersive empathy. And empathy and solidarity are such core themes of both programs that I think we're in for a treat today. Conn, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, Juha. Let me just share some slides here and then we'll get started. Great. Okay, so yeah, I'm here today to talk to you about a project called the Immersive Empathy project, which was developed by myself and my colleagues at the University of Galway, working with industry professionals from within the field of immersive technologies, and Galway Simon, who are a homelessness service provider in Galway here in Ireland. So my name is Conn Holohan. I am the director of the Centre for Creative Technologies here at the University of Galway. So what I'm going to do today is just first of all set out some of the debates and kind of concerns around immersive technologies, VR specifically, and empathy, and then think about how that informed the methodology that we use for our project, and then talk a little bit about the process of the project, and the outcomes. So just to crack on as quick as we can then. So, over the last 10 years, we've seen what's often been referred to as VR 2.0 ever since Meta, then Facebook, purchased Oculus in 2014. And there's been a shift within documentary filmmaking towards immersive filmmaking, and the idea that immersive experiences can create a witnessing platform. A big sort of touch point always in this was the 2015 360 film called Clouds Over Sidra, which was produced by the UN, and it conveyed the experience of a 12-year-old Syrian girl in a refugee camp in Jordan. And this was premiered at the Davos World Economic Forum in 2015 and shown to high-level donors, and a huge amount of money was raised. And so this kind of has sort of kickstarted the idea that VR is particularly useful at impacting on social attitudes and, as a tool for fundraising, apart from anything else. And connected to this is the idea about the relationship between VR and empathy. So this is Chris Milk, who directed that film. And in a 2015 TED Talk, he refers to VR as the ultimate empathy machine because of its ability to put the viewer, as it were, in the shoes of another person. When you put on the headset, you're immersed in that world, and that inherently is empathy creating. And this is something that the kind of technology firms have sort of very much emphasized themselves in terms of how they've promoted and sort of the public discourse around these technologies. The idea that VR is a tool for social good, or can be a tool for social good. So we see here the Meta VR for Good campaign, which they are a program which they developed, where they funded filmmakers, etc., to produce content around social issues, etc. And there is, there's a lot of the research that's been done around immersive technologies, and VR specifically over the last 10 years has focused on these questions about empathy and social attitudes. And the sample sizes have tended to be small, but there is evidence that it is particularly good at producing empathy, or indeed it is more effective than 2D film at producing empathy. However, there's also been quite significant critique of this empathy discourse around VR, and this quote here is from a scholar called Lisa Nakamura, and she is quite critical about this discourse and around kind of humanitarian VR, because her argument is essentially that it becomes a kind of form of misery tourism, or it can do. That what you end up, and particularly because VR as a technology remains quite inaccessible, it typically, people tend to watch VR in either third level institutions or museums, festivals, again, quite exclusionary spaces. And so what you end up having is people in privileged places putting on a headset and experiencing the life of someone who's marginalized in some way through geography or through economics. And so she uses this term, feeling good about feeling bad, that essentially when we put on, the danger is that we put on VR headset and we experience, for example, the experience of someone in a refugee camp, we feel bad for that person, but then we simultaneously feel good about ourselves for feeling bad. It reassures ourselves about our essential humanity. And she critiques this as part of a discourse around big tech, essentially trying to shift the discourse away from the critique of big tech around, democracy, social media, etc., towards the idea of these next set of tools as tools for social good. One of the critiques is that within this kind of humanitarian VR paradigm, people who experience suffering, etc., their lives become content, essentially. So what you get are filmmakers or experienced producers going into for example, the homeless community, etc., and creating content for other people to experience. And as Nakamura points out, it's because, for example, Black teenagers are shot or transgender people are attacked because homeless people suffer, that their experience becomes valuable. That's the experience that people want. So this is the critique, and indeed this critique can be extended to empathy itself, that empathy can be a problematic tool for social change. And here we see again the kind of typical, perhaps, viewing context where you have two white women watching an experience set somewhere quite different from where they are sitting. And that, again, this critique by Sonia Childress is that empathy can reinforce essentially whiteness or particular ideas about class, etc., as the norm against which others are judged. Roger, this kind of philosophical term that Roger Silverstone has coined, called proper distance, is quite a useful one for understanding this critique, that essentially when we put on that headset, for example, going back to the 12-year-old girl in a refugee camp, there's a lot of aspects of that experience that we can recognize as similar to our own. You know, her daily life, she eats, she goes to bed. The kind of rhythm of daily life is recognizable from our own. And the danger that Silverstone points out is that when we get too close to another's experience like that, the problem is we mightn't recognize how it's different from ours also. So that actually all the ways that all the economic and social structures that make our lives different from the lives that we're experiencing can become invisible within that kind of experience of closeness when we walk in another person's shoes. The Eric Jose Ramirez brings an interesting kind of philosophical critique of the ethics of virtual reality in his recent book, and he kind of puts forward two critiques of VR. One is what he calls the problem of semantic variance. In other words, the question is, can VR actually reproduce the experience of being in a refugee camp or of being homeless? And as he says, the problem is that a huge part of our experience is interpretative, and that comes from our own life experiences, etc. So when we, as he says, for VR to literally give us the experience of walking in another person's shoes, it would have to transfer that experience as it was, incomplete, to us, so that when we actually feel what this is. So he talks about, for example, as a comparison, people doing sleep outs as fundraising for homelessness, and the idea of sleeping out for a night is not the same as being homeless. It's not the same experience. So his critique is that essentially VR doesn't, of course, give us the experience of what it is to be another person, to live in their shoes. And the other critique he has around VR is that essentially, is it doing what it says it does? So he talks about this philosophical term known as nudging. And a nudge is something that influences our behavior. So an example is a speed bump. So when we drive over it, it slows us down as we're driving. And so nudges are things that we use to influence people's behavior. And he says, a key ethical question around a nudge is it transparent what it's doing? So, a speed bump, it's written bump, we know what it is, and we hopefully adjust our behavior in response to it. And he says one of the ethical issues around VR is it says it's doing one thing, which is giving us the experience of another person, but it's actually not doing it. So then the question becomes, well, what is it doing? He said, well, it's approximating that experience. It's giving us access to that experience. But what we tend to do is fill in the gaps with our pre-existing sort of biases and prejudices. So rather than actually giving us access to another person's experience, what it can end up doing is just reinforcing the perspective we already had on whether it's homelessness, etc. And so what he calls for instead is an understand or using VR so that people can become engaged witnesses. As he said, being an engaged witness isn't about experiencing life through someone else's eyes. It's bringing your own sensibilities to bear witness on a simulation and its events. So really, it's just about a different kind of positioning. So the question then is, how do we produce VR experiences that might sort of ethically situate the viewer in relation to the content or to relation to the real life experiences that it's communicating. So that brings us to our project. And so in order to respond to some of those critiques, the approach that we took in the Immersive Empathy project is drawn from what's known as participatory video methodologies. And participatory video methodologies are about kind of addressing the ethical questions that come about when a filmmaker goes into a community and uses that community for content. And because there's obvious power relations involved in that. And so what the participatory video methodology is about empowering communities to tell their own stories rather than telling stories on their behalf. It's about inclusive participation at every level of the kind of content creation process, so including, dissemination, exhibition, etc. So at this point then, I want to give you a little more breakdown on our project, the methodology, what we did. So Galway Simon Community are a homelessness service provider here in Galway, where I live and where our university is based. Galway is a small city on the west coast of Ireland. And so they approached us. We had been sort of working with various homeless organizations, trying to think about ways that we could use immersive technologies to engage the public around issues around homelessness. And so they were interested in this. They approached us. To give a bit of context, Ireland, like many places in Europe and beyond, is experiencing an extreme crisis around homelessness. So I've given this talk many times. Every time I have to increase these figures have increased year on year for a number of years. For context, in 2016 there were just under 7,000 people accessing emergency accommodation. So that's doubled in 8 years. And as we can see, there's that has impacted hugely in terms of family homelessness, child homelessness, etc. So there's a high housing crisis in Ireland, which has led to a huge homeless crisis. There is also a huge hidden homelessness crisis. People, for example, couch surfing or in precarious accommodation of various kinds. So one of the key motivations of the project was to communicate the breadth of this problem, of this crisis, and to challenge some of the existing kind of ideas and stereotypes around what homelessness is. So how did we do that? Well, we designed a structure that was all about trying to ensure co-creation and consent and empathy that throughout the process. So the key thing, what we're thinking about empathy, is that empathy isn't just something produced by the end project, but is something that is inherent to everything that we do throughout the process. And we'll come back, I'll talk about these in more detail. The first thing we did was we did oral history interviews. And I'll talk a little bit just about how we did that to give you a sense of what we mean by co-creation. So the idea initially was that the team would do oral history interviews with the participants who are clients of Galway Simon, who are all people who had experienced homelessness. And that through that we would use those oral history interviews, kind of long form interviews around their lives and their experiences, as a jumping off point for workshops that would ultimately lead to the film. But we were then thinking about, well, how can we give as much control back to the participants, as much creative control? And there's a really interesting article here about how the language of interviewing in documentary is problematic itself. I mean, this is particularly about migrant communities in the US, but I think the same applies for people who experience homelessness, is that they are people who have had a lot of experience of people from institutions asking them about themselves, asking them to tell their stories, to explain themselves, to explain, how did you get here? And so we thought, well, instead of me or someone else interviewing them, why not give training? So what we did was we trained all the participants in oral history interviewing techniques, and then they did peer-to-peer interviews. And that really transformed the dynamic of it, because what you had was people who had had similar experiences talking to each other and able to ask, for example, follow-up questions because they had had a similar experience that would be very different for me to ask that question as someone who hadn't had those experiences. So from those, we had a 2-day workshop in the University of Galway, in which we brought in all the participants and filmmakers, storytellers, project members. And we had one rule in this room, which was that anyone who was in the room had to participate in everything that happened in the room. So it was a series of storytelling exercises, narrative exercises. And in fact, in this photo, the university president is in this photo, and hopefully you can't tell who that is, and participated in everything while the president was in the room. So we did these exercises. we kind of workshop things around homelessness, etc. We came to some kind of we established some recurring themes around the idea of homelessness. For example, the idea that it can happen to anyone. Key thing was that homelessness reduces choices. And then things around home. So one of the participants talked about having been housed for the first time in 10 years, that for the first time he could walk around naked because he hadn't had the privacy to do that in the previous 10 years, which is something that, again, as someone who hasn't experienced homelessness, wouldn't necessarily occur to me. We introduced ideas about narrative structure, and we asked one of the first things we asked is, what do you want people to feel at the end of that narrative structure? And this was debated a lot and settled on anger as the thing that, but as it happens, that wasn't really how it turned out. We put those narratives, those individual narratives, into this structure, and from that we workshopped the structure for the film. One of the great things about sort of 360 filmmaking, in some ways, when you think about this co-creation, is 360 camera captures everything. There is no behind the camera. So when filming is happening, everybody else has to leave. So there's a degree of just relinquishing creative control at that moment. So this is one of the participants telling her story to camera. This is one of the kind of opening and closing scene happens in this kitchen, which is one of the spaces, the housing spaces that Galway Simon has, and the participants are talking around, and everyone else is in the other room just listening. All you can do is just watch and listen. So we made the film, and then we tested it. In the testing process, we showed it to 134 people between ages of 18 and 43, and we were measuring. We had a control group of people who just read transcripts based on the film, and we were measuring impact on empathy, on attitudes to homelessness. So some of the results that came out, just to pull out a couple, we measured state empathy, which is levels of empathy across 8 different emotions in the previous 30 minutes. And a higher score is a higher level of empathy. And we can see there, we see an increase in both groups, but a bigger increase in the VR group as opposed to the control group. Prejudice, we asked them the extent to which they believe homelessness has homeless people have a negative effect on society. And again, we see a bigger drop in terms of those prejudice levels amongst the VR group. This was the willingness to converse with people who are homeless, and again we see a greater increase. So we saw that it did have an impact on empathy levels. One of the interesting things is that was not sustained across time. So we did follow-up scores. So one of the things that perhaps that demonstrates is something like this it might be a useful tool, for example, for fundraising if you catch someone in the moment just after they watch. But unfortunately, the changes it makes don't seem to be sustained across time. We also did qualitative control testing, where we got people to talk through their experience of watching the film afterwards. And some of the things that came out were this ideas about that homelessness could happen to anyone, which again goes back to one of the things that came out in those workshops, that was successfully conveyed to the viewers, that the people who were in the film and who made the film were people they could relate to, were people just like them, and something had happened to them and they had become homeless. For example, one of the participants was a young woman, and a lot of the people watching it were college students, and so they really were often quite taken aback, and that this is someone who looks just like me, who could be me. And you get this sense of empathy coming out again. For example, I could empathize with her. She was my own age, etc. So we do get this sense of empathy and connection coming out in the qualitative interviewing around the film. And one of the things, again, we get is hope. So the participants that made the film had, by the end of the film, all been housed. And so, in fact, it became a narrative about hope and about community, about how essentially their community had helped them back out of homelessness, rather than about anger. But there's a lot of anger in there as well. But so really what the real impact of the project, however, became not about the impact on the viewers, but on the impact of the participants. And I think this is the really important thing to take from it. So, one of the key motivations was that for the people making it was that people were sick of this recurring images, the same images of what homelessness is. if you do a Google image search on homeless person, over and over again, you get a male rough sleeper. And as the statistics show us, that is not what homelessness is. Homelessness is much more diverse than that. So, this idea that you think of homelessness, you think of someone on the street, but it's much bigger thing. So that was one of the things that participants really wanted to convey. And that's one of the things that seems to have come over to viewers. But the biggest impact of the project was on the people who did it. One of the really most striking anecdotes that came out of it was one of the participants talked about how their family had lived beside the university their whole life. And the shortest way to Galway city centre from their house was through the university. And the university has open gates. Anyone can walk through them, but no member of their family had ever walked through the university because they didn't feel they belonged there. So the most impactful thing that we did was inviting people onto the campus as participants, as co-creators, as filmmakers, as researchers, not as guests, to work with us, alongside us, to produce this film. So this is a quote from one of the post-participant interviews, and he talked about meeting the president of the university, and the president gave him a compliment. He was so shocked by this that he went back in and said that the president of the United States is after praising me. And so but the idea that the president, he had inspired the president, gave him the confidence, and the next day not the next day, but a short time later, he put in an application for a place in university. So 3 of the participants of the 6 people who made the film have subsequently come and done the university access program. All of them have talked about the impact of the project on confidence, involvement. They've become more involved in all sorts of things, from volunteering to work. And so this is a photo from the launch of the film. And again, what I love from these photos is hopefully you can't tell who's an academic, who's a researcher, who's a filmmaker, who has experienced homelessness, who has not. And it talks about, this was a text we got from one of the participants at the end of the filmmaking, talking about the empathy and how that was the most significant thing of the project for the participants, was that empathy and co-creation and consent and participation was built into every stage of it. And so that's the thing I would take from this, is technology can be really useful as a communication tool and as a means of changing social attitudes and a means of engaging the wider community. But it also has a real power as a means of bringing and engaging with communities outside the academy, outside of the kind of the walls of the campus, and it can provoke really meaningful participation that can have real impacts on people's lives. Thank you. Let me stop.
Thank you very much, Conn. I really liked your presentation and how it really highlighted a very balanced approach. I feel like sometimes we get that, or tend to get stuck into this kind of technology hype, and we do things with technology for the sake of doing things with technology. I mean, I'm certainly guilty of it in the past and probably also in the future, because I'm the kind of person that tends to get excited about technology. But I am also very passionate about youth work. I come from a youth work field of practice background, and what you are highlighting here in terms of community impact and solidarity and participation is also really the core of youth work. And then I really see your projects as being also very viable and applicable across all sectors within the program. So super interesting stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to come in on that, so this was the first iteration of the project. We worked with this homelessness service provider, but a second iteration of the project, we worked with a youth volunteer organisation called Foróige here in Ireland, and 2 schools in Galway, what we call DESH schools, which are schools that have a catchment area that includes a certain proportion of students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And so we basically used the same methodology, working with cohorts from those groups to create. They both created short 360 films around the theme of empathy. So again, it was workshopping with them what stories that they want to tell, and both of them ended up being about bullying and technology and bullying, and so again, it was about empowerment. That's really, there was a skills provision element to it, but the really impactful thing, I think, was about how the technology became a means for them to tell stories, to work together, to participate, So yeah, I think, again, it's technology is, is really useful in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways it's useful is as a means of actually provoking engagement.
Yeah.
Like one of the, sorry, just to say, the one of the youth workers from Peroiga talked about it as the equivalent, like the VR as being like what they would do is like a pool table, as using a pool table or something like that, or a video game as a means of just sort of engaging with young people. So the VR kind of production process became something similar.
Certainly. You already mentioned also that not everyone has access to this kind of technology, and especially with young people, I think it might even be that some will join the activities just for the sake of having access to that technology. So it becomes kind of selling point in that sense as well. Or as you said, which is very much in the core of youth work, that you do things and all the youth work happens around that.
Yeah.
So whatever you do is not even necessarily always the point.
Exactly.
If listeners have questions still coming up, do send them in the Q&A panel, but I have a couple here, which I would like to broach. We already kind of touched on the topic, and you mentioned it before, that there is the problem with using VR currently is the kind of high price of admission, and not everyone has the access to this technology. But your project clearly highlights that technology can link and connect in a beneficial way to very human-centric values of empathy, solidarity, and a sense of community. So my question to you is, if someone would like to do something with a similar impact or a similar goal, but don't have access to VR, what would be your takeaway? Is it perhaps possible to leverage the same kind of benefits with a different technological solution? What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, it comes back to the methodology. What's important here is not the technology. It's about building those principles of respect, empathy, co-creation into the process. I mean, this project comes out of projects I've done over the last 10 years, just with, for the one of the better word, traditional filmmaking. So I've worked in the past with homelessness organizations, with an organization that supported women who'd experienced domestic violence, and we did very similar kind of projects around empowering people to tell their story through, in this case, as it was just 2D filmmaking. So really, it's about how you approach, and so the example I gave about the oral history interviewing, I think is really instructive, because that's something that it's only by sitting down and thinking, okay, what concrete ways can I hand over control to the participants, that you then start to, it forces you to think, well, because our instant sort of initial think was, well, if we need interviews, we'll interview the participants. But then if you think, okay, no, stop. At every stage, if you think, how can I hand over control and do that? Now, and that's not always easy. And that can be, because you don't know what's going to happen. You have to be ready for failure. You have to be ready for the project to go in ways that you didn't expect, and maybe that you don't even want. And that's happened in the past with projects that I've done, that it ended up not being the thing that I expected it to be. But you have to accept that if this is the approach you're going to take. So in a sense, it's technology agnostic. What it's about is about using something to empower people to tell their stories, and just always having that as the principle at the forefront of everything that you do. Like, again, going back to the thing about the workshops, that was really that 2-day workshop we had was transformative for, I think, everybody in the room. And that's the other thing I'd say is, I can't speak highly enough of the value of doing this from the perspective of the researcher, because like the participants talked about how it changed their lives. But it changed my life, and I think it changed the life of everyone involved in the project. Like those 2 days spent in that room, where, again, not just the participants, but also the researchers, the filmmakers, etc., we all had to tell our stories, because that was the deal. And so it had a huge impact on how, so the participants saw us. The one of the people from Galway, Simon, the organization, talked afterwards about he was wary about working with academics. He had this kind of he had this kind of cliched idea of what that we would be sitting around taking notes, looking, kind of anthropologists. And he talked about a moment on the second day of that workshop when one of the participants was telling his story, and he got really upset, and he left the room, and the person who went to comfort him was one of the research team. And that was organic because that relationship had been developed. So it's hard work. It's, at times it can be sort of traumatic work because of some of the stories you're interacting with, but it's really, really valuable work.
Yeah. I can see from the way you speak about these things that for you the work itself is really the core, and the impact that your work is having is in the core of how you approach these things. But I still want to ask you the question because I will preface my question with the viewpoint that sometimes in the field we struggle to kind of figure out, do we design things because policy, and maybe in the question of or in the sense of the Erasmus Plus and ESC programs, the program guide says that we need to do certain things. On the other hand, some of us are really passionate about the work we do, and we really see and we recognize needs in the communities that we work with. Or could be that we are just really excited about technology and the opportunities that technology kind of can bring. So my question to you is maybe about innovation and developing new things, developing new projects, new ideas. Do you think it matters whether it's the excitement about technology that sparks the idea originally, or the passionate kind of view to your work? Does it matter which is the source?
That's a good question. Well, you would hope that they are inherently parallel anyway, because if we're passionate about technology, it's because we're passionate about what it can do, and therefore what it can do leads us hopefully towards things that are for good. But I also think, to speak to your question, is it speaks to the power of interdisciplinarity as well, because the center that I lead here, the goal of the center is to bring together research around the intersection of computer science, arts, humanities, creative practice, etc. So we bring people together, and we've got computer scientists who are excited about the code, and we've got creative practitioners who are excited about the about the creative practice, and we've got humanities scholars who want to dive into the kind of social, cultural kind of significance and critique of things. And when you bring those people together, the virtuous sort of circle is when all of those, everyone can essentially be passionate about the thing they're passionate about, and it works together to create something great. And so, and it speaks, going back to our own project, the key thing is a great team. Like, we were very lucky. We've got an amazing team of people who all shared the same ethos, but all of whom had different areas of expertise. And some of those people do just want to get into the weeds of the technology and, what can it do, push it. But the project gave them a context where they could do that within the kind of, this wider social, good. So yeah, I think, I don't think ideally those things are in any way sort of, what's the word, not aligned. Hopefully they can work well together.
Yeah, we have two audience questions which we can still, I think, cover in the time we have left. So Gareth Young is asking, the table of results seemed to say that there were no statistical differences, yet the graphs and what you were saying were observably different. So can you say more about the quantitative versus the qualitative findings?
Yeah, sure. So, well, this is where the interdisciplinary expertise comes in, because my colleague Charlotte, who is the psychologist on the team, said, is the one who crunches the numbers. Yeah. So, like, to be honest, the numbers they were statistically different. Or there was statistically significant the findings, but not hugely so. So the qualitative findings, in terms of when we did those think alouds, etc., were, really brought out some of those themes that we we had kind of hoped to go in with or to explore. But yeah, I mean, one of the things we're doing next to measure is, so we're currently taking the film and screening it or presenting it to alongside talks from the participants and myself. And so one of the things we want to measure is, does that increase the actual impact in terms of when you measure those empathy levels, etc. And just, we've only started doing that, but some of the initial stuff would say it increases the impact. But yeah, I mean, I again, going back to the thing, I think, you know, the impact that, if you just think about it in terms of those, you know, the quantitative empathy impact on viewers, I don't think that's, you know, in itself is enough to really kind of understand the benefits that can happen with this. And so it goes back to that thing about the kind of the technological utopianism around VR, that you put this headset on, you'll feel more empathetic. I personally, I just don't buy that. You know, it has to be about a wider context and how it's presented and how it's understood and how it becomes part of a conversation, essentially.
Yeah, one more audience question before we have to conclude. Again, Gareth is asking, in our own studies on immersive empathy, we looked at 2 VR experiences that focused on, one, race, and second, disability. One of the things that we found was that public opinion, the socio-political and media, deeply impacted reported measures on empathy. And the question is, does the Irish context change the generalization of your findings on VR beyond audiences on the island of Ireland?
That's a great question. Because, and it goes back to the other kind of point around, you know, it being experienced in a context, because, you know, for example, there's a lot of visibility around homelessness as an issue in Ireland, and also I think there's a lot of baseline empathy, in fact, around homelessness, because it's seen as such a widespread social problem. But one of the key things really we were interested in, and this isn't captured by the quantitative, is about those elements about what understanding the kind of simplified narratives around homelessness and what homelessness is. I think that is something that does go beyond the Irish context. It has been measurably demonstrated in studies around European media and the representations of homelessness. So it's difficult. I mean, again, this is a very small scale study in terms of the actual numbers that we saw the film. But it goes, I just take it back to that other point in terms of that. I think that the really interesting findings are actually in that more qualitative stuff about how does this actually challenge deep-seated kind of ideas and narratives around homelessness.
Yeah. As interesting as it would be to continue this conversation, unfortunately, we have to wrap things up here. Thank you so much, Conn, for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks, Milliam.
And as a very brief outro for today, I would mention that we continue after the summer holidays with these kinds of topics. And first, we'll be talking about twin transition, especially from the viewpoint of the youth field. And we have an engaging speaker about that. The session for October is still unconfirmed, so I cannot share that with you yet. But then in November, we are talking about kind of building in impact from the start in the projects, especially around topics on digital transformation. And then finally, in December, in the place of digital dialogues, we will be taking our digital spotlight session as we did last year, and more information from that will follow as well. With that, I will say thank you to everyone listening, and thank you again to Conn, and see you online in the next one. Have a wonderful summer, everyone. Bye-bye.